My mother-in-law poured something strange into my drink when she thought I wasn't watching. Special cocktail for my favorite son-in-law, she said with a sugary smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I forced a grateful grin, thanked her politely, and then, when no one was paying attention, quietly switched my glass with her husband's. Gerald, who never missed a chance to mock my career choices. 45 minutes later, everything began to unravel. My name is Julian Mercer. I'm 32 years old and work as an independent photographer based in Asheville, North Carolina. I built my business from the ground up. No handouts, no shortcuts. From weddings to wildlife to glossy magazine spreads, I take on whatever job pays the bills and I do it well. But to my in-laws, especially Diane, none of that has ever counted for much. How's the little photography hobby coming along? Gerald would sneer across the dinner table at Sunday gatherings, his voice laced with condescension. He was an investment banker through and through, the kind of man who viewed success in terms of property square footage and market returns. Every family dinner was the same cycle. Diane doting over her daughter with too much wine in her glass, Gerald grilling me like I was a failing startup. Haley, my wife, would always squeeze my hand under the table, a silent apology that never stopped hurting. That week, I'd been on assignment in the snow-blanketed plains of Montana, trekking through knee-deep drifts to capture photos of bison for National Geographic. It was brutal work, exhausting, cold, but exhilarating in the way only real passion can be. I hadn't slept much. My body ached. All I wanted was a hot shower and a warm bed. But Haley had insisted. We had to go to her mother's birthday dinner. Just for a couple of hours, she'd said with those soft, pleading eyes I could never refuse. I should have listened to the knot twisting in my gut the moment Diane cornered me in the kitchen. Her smile was too wide, her hands a little too shaky as she offered me the drink. I made it special just for you, she said, her voice light but her eyes scanning the room like she was afraid of being caught. I took the glass out of politeness, but alarm bells were already going off in my head. Something felt off. I just didn't realize how wrong things were about to go. Haley and I met 6 years ago at an art exhibition in downtown Asheville. One of my landscape collections had been featured, and she was there finishing up her master's in environmental science. We hit it off immediately, drawn together by a shared love for the world, hers in protecting it, mine in capturing it frame by frame. She was smart, grounded, full of warmth. Being with her felt like breathing fresh air after years of holding your breath. But from the very beginning, her parents were a different story. Gerald barely hid his disappointment the first time we met. He had envisioned a very specific type of man for his daughter, someone with a pressed suit, a steady paycheck, and a corner office. Not some freelance artist who spent more time in the wild than in an office. He didn't want a son-in-law, he wanted a clone. Diane was always more subtle in her disdain. She'd compliment my photography with a practiced smile, only to follow it up with questions about when I planned to get a real job. At family gatherings, she'd smile sweetly, and then introduce me to her friends not as her son-in-law, but as the photographer. Like I was the hired help who happened to be dating her daughter. I spent years trying to win them over, brought expensive bottles of wine to dinners, casually dropped names of high-profile clients, and pointed out my work when it got published. But none of it mattered. In their eyes, I wasn't a serious partner. I was a phase their daughter would eventually outgrow. Last Christmas, I overheard Diane on the phone, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Haley could have married Thomas, you know. The orthopedic surgeon. Family money, but she chose the creative one. She let the word hang there, dripping with disdain. Creative like it was a diagnosis. Something incurable. Something regrettable. Gerald was never one to beat around the bush. When Haley and I shared the news that we were trying to have a baby, he pulled me aside with that smug, fatherly concern I'd come to hate. Kids are expensive, son. Maybe think about real employment before bringing one into the world. Like I hadn't been pulling 14-hour days in the wilderness, living off cold coffee and adrenaline to build something meaningful. Something real. I never told Haley any of it. She loved her parents, blind spots and all, and I didn't want to be the wedge that made her choose between me and them. So I kept the peace. I smiled at Gerald's limp jokes, praised Diane's dry roasts, and nodded through every passive-aggressive dinner. But there were red flags I shouldn't have brushed off. The way Diane would conveniently ask Haley to help in the kitchen every time I mentioned a successful shoot. The way I always seemed to be left out of the spontaneous family photos. The time Gerald, staring directly at me, suggested Haley consider therapy for her impulsive decisions. I ignored all of it, convincing myself that time would melt their icy resentment, that they'd come around eventually. I was wrong. That Friday, the night of Diane's birthday dinner, I came back from Montana with windburned cheeks and a camera full of gold. Bison moving like ghosts through snowdrifts. It was a shoot that would pay our bills for the next 3 months at least. I was exhausted, aching from head to toe. But I scrubbed off the dirt, threw on a clean button-down, and we made the drive to their pristine colonial house in the most polished neighborhood in town. The evening started off the same as always. Gerald launched into another boastful recap of a recent deal. Diane fluttered around the table like a high society hostess. Haley's brother Owen made polite small talk, and his wife Vanessa asked about my latest shoot. I sat quietly, sipping a beer and silently counting down the minutes until we could escape. Then, after the main course, Diane stood up with a proud little flourish. "I made my famous sangria for dessert," she announced. Everyone clapped or chuckled like it was a big event. She vanished into the kitchen, and I followed a moment later, offering to help carry glasses. That's when I saw it. 2 glasses set slightly apart from the others, catching the overhead light. As I stepped through the doorway, she didn't hear me at first. I watched her tilt a small vial, barely larger than a thumb, into one of the glasses. The liquid was clear, quick, no smell, no color, just a faint shimmer like oil on water. She tucked the vial away the instant she heard my footsteps. "Oh, Julian, I've got this," she said too brightly, spinning around with one of the glasses in hand. "This one's for you. Special recipe for my favorite son-in-law." My stomach twisted. My throat tightened. The glass had the faintest film on the surface, barely visible, catching the light in a way no sangria ever should. "The light's tricky in here. Let me help you carry those," I said smoothly, stepping forward before she could object. I took both glasses from Diane's hands with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Back in the dining room, Gerald was thumbing through his phone, half listening to a story Owen was telling. He barely looked up as I approached. "Sangria, sir?" I said, setting the tampered glass down in front of him, careful not to draw attention. I slid into my seat, cradling the other glass, the one meant for me but didn't take a sip. "Actually," I added casually, "I think I'll just stick with water tonight. Still recovering from the altitude." A small, harmless excuse, easy to swallow. 45 minutes later, Gerald was drenched in sweat, his face an ashen gray. He pushed back from the table mid-sentence, his napkin falling to the floor, and staggered toward the bathroom. The sounds that followed were unmistakable. Violent, wet, guttural. The kind of sickness that doesn't come from bad shrimp. Diane's face drained of color the instant it began. Her fork trembled against her plate, and when her eyes met mine across the table, something passed between us. A silent, electric recognition. I knew what she had done, and now she knew I knew. I didn't flinch, didn't accuse her. I just took another bite of chocolate cake. Slowly, deliberately, as if nothing unusual had happened. Haley jumped from her seat and ran after her father, concern written all over her face. In the confusion that followed, Gerald insisted it had to be food poisoning. Diane stammered something about the shellfish being suspect, nervous, defensive, grasping for explanations. I stayed quiet. I simply reached under the table, slipped the untouched glass, my glass, into my camera bag. Something had shifted inside me that night. It wasn't rage, not a burning fury. It was something colder, sharper, a calculated stillness. I wasn't going to scream or accuse. I wasn't going to stoop to their level. No, I was going to make them look straight into the mirror, see themselves as they truly were. That Monday, I took the glass to someone I trusted, Jason, a former client and a forensic toxicologist with a side lab he ran for private work. "Personal or professional?" he asked as I handed him the evidence. "Family matter," I said quietly. 3 days later, he called. "Julian, that wasn't sangria. There were benzodiazepines in it. Not enough to kill, but enough to knock someone out cold. 4, maybe 6 hours of blackout, maybe some short-term memory loss. Where the hell did this come from?" I didn't answer. I just asked him to email me a written report and thanked him before hanging up. That night, I told Haley I needed to skip Sunday dinner for a while. "I've got that exhibition in Atlanta coming up, and I really need to focus," I said, forcing an apologetic smile. She looked a little disappointed but nodded, understanding. I didn't tell her the real reason, not yet. There were still pieces missing from the puzzle. Over the next 2 weeks, I started digging. It didn't take long. Diane had not 1, not 2, but 3 active prescriptions for Xanax, each from different doctors, cleverly spread out across counties. Medical records weren't hard to find when you knew where to look, or more importantly, who owed you favors. She'd been doubling, sometimes tripling doses for years. And the rumors? They were everywhere once I started listening. Stories whispered at country club brunches and neighborhood barbecues about how Diane had acted strangely at a neighbor's party, slurring, wandering off with things that didn't belong to her. How a tennis friend accused her of stealing a bracelet. How some swore they'd seen her pocket wine bottles at fundraisers, like she didn't care anymore who noticed. Stories her family worked hard to silence. Scandals paid off or brushed under designer rugs. But now I was paying attention. I gathered everything, printed every report, every prescription, every piece of proof, and waited for the right moment. It came sooner than I expected. One evening over dinner, Haley mentioned that her mom was asking for new photos for her social media profile. She specifically asked if you would take them, Haley said, clearly surprised. She said she wanted something professional. I nodded, trying not to show my reaction. Sure, let's set it up for Saturday. That weekend, I arrived at their house alone. One hand carried my camera bag, the other a sealed envelope. Diane was already waiting in the foyer, dressed in a tailored blouse, makeup flawlessly done. She looked like she was heading to a magazine cover shoot, not standing in the middle of a confrontation. Gerald's at the office, she said with a polite, practiced smile. Before we start, I said, lowering my voice, there's something you need to see. I handed her the envelope. Inside, the toxicology report from the lab, along with printed records of her overlapping Xanax prescriptions. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the papers. Her eyes scanned the documents, and for a moment she looked like a porcelain doll about to crack. This is absurd, she whispered. I would never— We both know what happened, I interrupted, my voice quiet but sharp. What I don't know is why. She lowered the papers slowly, her expression changing. The mask slipped. Her face hardened into something older, colder. You're not good enough for my daughter, she said flatly. You never will be. A man should provide security, not pictures. And drugging your daughter's husband provides security? I asked, keeping my tone steady. I wasn't here to yell. I was here to finish this. It wasn't going to hurt you, she hissed. Just make you sick. Miss that ridiculous gallery opening you've been bragging about for months? Show Haley that you're unreliable. I let her words hang in the air. I let the silence sting. Here's what happens next, I said. You're going to tell Gerald what you did. And then the both of you are going to treat me with basic respect. Not because you've suddenly had a change of heart, but because the alternative is far worse. Her lip curled. She'll never believe you. Not over us. I picked up my camera bag and slung it over my shoulder. Maybe not, I said, but she'll believe the lab report, the prescription records. And I think the neighbors you've alienated over the years might have a few stories to tell. So the question is, are you willing to bet your relationship with Haley on that? I walked out without taking a single photo. That night, Diane called Haley in tears, said I'd behaved inappropriately, claimed I'd been aggressive and threatening during our session. When Haley confronted me, her face was tight with confusion. What happened today? She asked. Mom says you completely lost it. I couldn't lie anymore. I showed her everything, the lab report, the prescriptions, even a few texts from her mother I'd kept. Messages that started passive-aggressive and gradually turned downright hostile over the years. Messages I'd ignored for Haley's sake. My mother wouldn't do this, she said again and again, but her voice wavered each time like she was trying to convince herself more than me. The next day, she went to confront them alone. I didn't go with her. I waited at home, pacing the length of our living room, until the sun started to fall. When she returned, her eyes were swollen and red from crying. She looked exhausted, broken. My father says it's all a misunderstanding, she murmured, that you're trying to drive a wedge between us, that you're insecure about your career and trying to make them the villains. I nodded. I had expected this exact response. What do you think? I asked gently. She didn't answer. She just crawled into bed, turned her back to me, and pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. I'd finally pushed back, but somehow they'd still managed to twist the knife. Now I was the villain in their carefully spun narrative. And worse, they'd planted a seed of doubt in the only person whose opinion had ever truly mattered to me. For 2 weeks, the silence between us was louder than any accusation. Haley barely spoke to me. She visited her parents alone, came home with red-rimmed eyes and a storm cloud hanging over her head. The silence between us wasn't angry. It was heavier than that. It was uncertainty, the kind that eats away at you slowly. So I buried myself in my work, long hours in my studio, editing wildlife shots, lining up pitches for magazines, pretending that deadlines were the only thing weighing on me. I waited for the storm to pass, waited for her to come back to me fully. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived. No return address, just my name scrawled in looping, unfamiliar handwriting. I opened it slowly, feeling that now familiar prickle along the back of my neck. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. You should see this. Signed, Vanessa, Owen's wife. My hands were already shaking when I plugged the drive into my laptop. A folder opened. Video files, security footage. Home surveillance from Gerald and Diane's house. The timestamps matched the night of the birthday dinner. The first video showed Diane in the kitchen. Calm, deliberate. She pulled out a small vial and poured something into one of 2 glasses. Her movements were precise, practiced, chilling. Then I appeared in the frame, entering the kitchen just as she tried to act casual. Then came the footage of the dining room. I handed Gerald the glass. He barely looked up from his phone as he drank. But that wasn't all. There was more. Footage from after we'd left. Diane screaming at Gerald, her face twisted with rage. You weren't supposed to drink that one, she shrieked. And then Gerald, red-faced and shouting back, this isn't the first time you've pulled something like this. I watched that clip 3 times, not just to make sure I'd seen it right, but because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't some one-time act of desperation. This was routine, patterned. And Gerald, he knew. The next file hit harder, 2 days after the dinner. The living room again. Gerald and Diane arguing. He knows what you did, Gerald said, pacing. So what? Diane replied coolly, lounging like nothing was wrong. It's his word against mine. Haley will never choose him over her family, and if she does, then she's not the daughter I raised. My stomach turned. And don't worry, she continued. I've already started talking to her about their marriage. Planting seeds. By the time I'm done, she'll be filing for divorce and thinking it was her idea. I slammed the laptop shut. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was a campaign. A long, calculated effort to isolate Haley from anyone who didn't fit into their perfect blueprint. And they'd been doing it for years. Controlling her. Undermining her reality. Playing God with her relationships. I picked up my phone and called Vanessa. Why did you send this to me? I asked, my voice barely steady. There was a pause. Then she said, soft and measured, because they did the same thing to me when I married Owen. She took a breath. They tried to break us up for 2 years. Said I wasn't good enough. That I was distracting him, that I'd never fit in. And the worst part? It almost worked. Why didn't you tell us? I asked. Owen doesn't know, she admitted, voice thick. He worships his father, believes every word that comes out of his mouth. I've tried to tell him, but he just thinks I'm paranoid. I couldn't go through it again. Not watching them do it to you, too. The next day, a message popped up on my phone. Gerald, we should talk. Man to man. No wives. I met him at his country club. He'd reserved a private room, dim lights, leather chairs, the scent of money in the air. He was already seated, sipping bourbon like we were old friends instead of enemies circling each other. Julian, he began, his tone calm, rehearsed. Families are complicated. My wife, she can be difficult, protective, but she means well. Drugging someone means well? I asked, my eyes never leaving his face. He waved his hand, dismissing the accusation like it was a smudge on his cufflink. A misunderstanding. You're taking this too personally? I stared at him for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my bones. This man wasn't apologizing. He wasn't even pretending to be sorry. He was playing a game. But this time, I wasn't interested in losing. Diane takes medication for anxiety, Gerald said, his voice slick and composed, like a man who had rehearsed this line many times. She probably mixed up the glasses. It was a mistake. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at him. And then I said quietly, I have the security footage. For a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Then his entire face changed, like watching a mask being pulled off. The warmth vanished. What remained was cold, calculating, corporate, the real Gerald. So, he said after a beat, folding his hands, what do you want? Money? Is that what this is about? My stomach churned. He thought I was blackmailing him. He thought everything came down to leverage like it did in his world of hostile takeovers and cutthroat negotiations. I always knew you married Haley for financial reasons, he added, with that smug, dismissive tone he reserved for people he considered beneath him. I want you both to leave us alone, I said simply. Stop trying to convince Haley I'm not good enough. Stop interfering in our marriage. Stop planting doubts in her head. Gerald leaned forward slowly, resting his elbows on the table, eyes narrowing. You really think this is the first time we've dealt with someone like you? There was something venomous in his tone now. A kind of practiced arrogance, like he was about to deliver the final blow in a closing argument. People like you show up thinking they've won something because they've got a ring and a promise, he said, sneering. You think love is enough? You think it lasts? You're temporary, Julian, just like the others. Then he smiled, wide and condescending. Haley always comes home, always. Ask her about Thomas. Ask her about the fiancé before you. That stopped me cold. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice low. Gerald's grin grew. She was engaged before she met you. Nice guy, doctor, good pedigree. We didn't like his background. Took us 6 months to convince her he was wrong for her. She broke it off. Came home crying to Daddy. He leaned back in his chair triumphant. History repeats, son. I left without saying another word. On the drive home, I called Bethany, Haley's college roommate, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't waste time with small talk. Did Haley ever date someone named Thomas? I asked. A pause, then her voice dropped. Oh God, yeah, that was awful. He was perfect for her. Kind, ambitious, grounded. They were happy. But her parents, they started dropping hints, suggesting things. That he was unfaithful, manipulative. Haley started finding things. Texts, emails. Things that didn't make sense. But they made her believe. She told me once he betrayed her, I said, trying to piece it together. Bethany exhaled slowly. He didn't. Her parents planted it all. Thomas tried to show her the truth, but by the time he did, it was too late. She didn't trust him anymore. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about me. This was a long-established pattern of control. Their love wasn't nurturing, it was suffocating. They had a blueprint for Haley's life, and anyone who didn't fit was cut away like rot. I didn't confront Haley. Not yet. She needed more than my word. She needed clarity. She needed proof. She needed to see it all. So I started digging. I tracked down Thomas, who was understandably hesitant at first, but when I told him everything about the sangria, the manipulation, the footage, he broke. He sent me old emails between him and Haley, conversations from just before their engagement crumbled. You could see the progression, her growing doubt, his growing frustration, and then the fallout. But it didn't stop there. I reached out to other ex-boyfriends, friends Haley had grown close to in college and early in her career, people who had just disappeared from her life. One by one, the stories lined up. People who had encouraged her to think for herself, to chase her dreams, to create distance from her controlling parents. And each time they'd been silenced, pushed away, rewritten as villains in her narrative. Vanessa stepped in again, more determined than ever. She sent more security footage, secret moments captured in grainy clarity. In one clip, Diane and Gerald stood in their kitchen, calmly plotting like corporate strategists. Once they divorce, we'll convince her to move back home, Gerald said. She can run the foundation, meet someone stable, someone we approve of. She won't even realize it was us, Diane added. We'll make it feel like her choice. I stared at the screen, barely blinking. Their tone was casual, like they were discussing dinner plans, not dismantling their daughter's life. I gathered everything. Emails, text messages, video files, prescriptions. I copied it all onto a single USB drive and backed it up 3 different ways. Then I made a plan. I invited Owen and Vanessa over for dinner. I didn't tell Haley, not yet. That night, I set the table, lit candles, and waited for the moment. I wasn't just serving dessert. I was about to burn down the image of her parents, brick by brick. I connected my laptop to the TV. There's something you both need to see, I said, my voice calm but tight. Haley curled into the corner of the couch, arms wrapped around her knees. Owen sat forward, tension already drawing his shoulders high. I hit play. For the next hour, we watched it all, unedited, unvarnished. The security footage, the arguments, the recordings of Diane carefully pouring the drink, of Gerald admitting it wasn't the first time. Their cold, calculated discussions about manipulating Haley, about divorcing me, about grooming her future. Haley didn't move. Her face was pale and unreadable, eyes locked on the screen like she was staring into a dream she couldn't wake from. Owen kept shaking his head, muttering under his breath, "That's not my parents. That can't be my parents." When the final clip faded to black, the room fell into heavy silence. Then Haley turned to me. Her cheeks were wet with tears, her voice broken. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I swallowed, watching her carefully. "Because I needed you to see it for yourself," I said. "All of it. Not just what they did to me. What they've done to you your entire life." Owen shot to his feet, furious. "This is fake. It's edited. You cut it to make them look bad. My parents wouldn't do this." Vanessa reached out and placed a hand on his arm, gently pulling him back. "They did it to us too, Owen." He blinked, looking down at her like he'd never seen her before. "Why do you think they suddenly started liking me after I got pregnant?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "It wasn't acceptance, it was leverage. They saw James as a foothold, a way to make me stay quiet, stay close." Owen's expression crumpled. "You never told me." "I tried," she said, eyes full. "You didn't want to hear it." Later that night, Haley crawled into bed beside me, quiet, eyes distant. I reached for her hand and she didn't pull away. "I need time to process this," she whispered. "I understand. But I believe you, and I'm sorry I doubted you." I kissed the back of her hand and said nothing. There was nothing left to say in that moment. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. The next morning, Diane called. Haley answered and put it on speaker. "Darling," Diane said brightly, the practiced cheerfulness grating. "I was thinking, you should come stay with us for a little while, just until things calm down. Your father and I are worried about you. Marriage is hard, and sometimes a little space gives clarity." Haley's voice was flat. "Mom, I've seen the videos." A beat of silence on the other end. "What videos?" "The footage of you drugging Julian's drink," Haley said, her voice steady now. "The conversations you and Dad had, the ones where you talk about sabotaging our marriage." Another pause, then, "Haley, whatever he's shown you, it's been manipulated. You know Julian has always been jealous of our family, resentful of—" "Stop!" Haley cut her off, sharp and certain. "We're coming over tonight. All of us. Owen, Vanessa, Julian, and me. We're going to talk about this. As a family. No more lies." She ended the call. Then she turned to me. "They're going to deny everything. Try to twist it. Make you the villain." I nodded. "I know. So what's our plan?" For the first time in weeks, I smiled. "I think it's time your parents met the real me. Not the one they've tried to discredit. The one who doesn't just take photos, but knows how to tell a story." That night, we arrived at Gerald and Diane's house. I carried my camera bag on one shoulder and a quiet resolve in my chest. Owen and Vanessa were already there, seated stiffly on the cream-colored couch in the living room that always smelled faintly of lemon polish and old secrets. Gerald stood with a glass of scotch in hand, confident as ever. "I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding," he said. "No misunderstanding," I replied, setting up my tripod. "I'm documenting this conversation. For the family archives, Diane's face twisted immediately. This is private family business, she snapped. Exactly, I said, securing the camera. Family business, and I'm family, even though you've spent years trying to convince everyone otherwise. For the next 2 hours, we laid it all out. The drugged drink, the prescription records, the manipulation of past boyfriends, the digital trail. Their own voices recorded and exposed, every lie, every carefully constructed illusion stripped bare. Gerald and Diane fought back, of course. They called me unstable, manipulative, a parasite, but with every denial, I responded with another clip, another email, another moment they hadn't realized was caught. Their faces paled. Their voices grew brittle. Then finally, Haley stood up. I looked at them, my parents, two people I once admired more than anyone in the world. I love you both, I said, my voice steady but full of pain. You've always been my parents, and I'll always care about you. But what you did? That's something I can't just forgive. You've crossed a line, and from here on out, you don't get to control my life anymore. Owen stood beside me, his hand finding mine as he nodded firmly. We're adults now. We make our own decisions. We choose our own partners, our own future, and you don't get a say in that anymore. Diane's face crumpled. She didn't cry out of guilt or regret. No, her tears were the bitter tears of someone realizing they were no longer in charge. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was just devastated that she couldn't pull the strings anymore. Gerald, on the other hand, looked like a man struck by lightning, shocked, disoriented, unable to believe that his children were standing up to him. Before we turned to leave, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. I handed it to Gerald. His eyes narrowed with suspicion as he took it from me. This has everything, I said quietly. The videos, the emails, the messages, the testimonies, everything you've done, it's all there. It's yours now. His brows furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, clearly uneasy. It means, I said, holding his gaze, I'm not out to destroy your reputation. I won't share this with anyone. Not with your business partners, not with your country club buddies, not with anyone. That would hurt Haley, and I'd never do that to her. But I paused long enough to let the weight of my words sink in. If you ever try to interfere in our marriage again, if you so much as try to manipulate Haley or turn her against me, copies of everything will be sent to every person in your precious circle. Every friend, every associate, every person who's ever admired you. Gerald didn't say anything at first, but in that moment, for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Respect. He gave me a slow nod. I underestimated you, he admitted, almost sounding impressed. Yes, I replied, my tone calm but unshakable. You did. 6 months went by. A lot happened in the time. Haley and Owen both started therapy, trying to work through the emotional wreckage their parents had left behind. Healing wasn't instant, but it was happening. Bit by bit, they were taking back control of their lives, their peace, their future. As for Diane and Gerald, they kept their distance. There were a few text messages here and there, holiday greetings, birthday wishes, vague check-ins, but for the most part, they honored the boundaries we had set. It was quiet, peaceful even. But in the back of my mind, I never fully let my guard down. Then came the holidays. That's when it happened. They sent us an invitation, an actual physical card in the mail. On the front was a photo of a winter landscape, serene and hopeful. Inside, the message read simply, "Let's start fresh. Dinner at our place. Just family." Haley looked torn. "I want to go," she said. "They're still my parents, and they're trying. At least it looks that way." I nodded. "Then we'll go. But we're not walking in there with blind hope. We stay sharp. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but I won't pretend they've changed." When we arrived, everything seemed normal. The house was warm, lights glowing softly, the smell of roasted herbs and fresh bread filling the air. Diane had gone all out. Turkey, stuffing, wine, the works. She welcomed us with a practiced smile, and to her credit, she made an effort to be kind. Gerald was unusually charming, asking about my latest photography projects like he genuinely cared. For a while, I let myself relax just a little. Then, after dinner, Gerald turned to me. "Come into my study for a moment," he said, his tone friendly but deliberate. "I have something I'd like to discuss with you." Curious, I followed him. The study was dimly lit, smelling faintly of cigar smoke and aged wood. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, offering one to me with that familiar, calculated calm. "I've been thinking about your career," he began. "Photography's been good to you, I know that. But have you ever thought about expanding, diversifying a bit? I could bring you into my firm, junior partner track. The salary would be, well, considerable." I took the glass from him but didn't drink. I studied his face, his expression carefully composed, as always. "Why?" I asked plainly. "Why would you offer me that?" He gave a small smile like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You're family now, and frankly, I respect how you handled everything. You stood your ground, you protected my daughter. That's what a real man does." I stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, I set the glass down on the table, untouched. "I appreciate the offer," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But the answer is no." Gerald's smile faltered, tightening at the edges. The easy charm he wore like a tailored suit started to fray. "Julian, be reasonable," he said, his voice clipped. "This is an olive branch. A chance for us to move forward." I met his eyes, unwavering. "No," I said again, firmer this time. "This isn't peace, it's just another power play. You think you can buy me off, like everyone else you've ever manipulated. But you can't, Gerald. And the truth is, it eats you alive that Haley loves me exactly as I am. Without your money, without your name." His mask dropped all at once. The businessman disappeared, replaced by the man underneath, the one used to getting his way through control, not connection. "Don't be a fool," he hissed, eyes narrowing. "Everyone has a price." I stood up slowly, my chair scraping lightly against the hardwood. "And that right there," I said quietly, "is why you'll never understand your daughter. Because she doesn't." Without waiting for a response, I turned and left the study, walking back into the warm glow of the dining room. Diane was seated with Haley, flipping through old photo albums and laughing softly. "Look at this one," Diane was saying, tapping a picture with her finger. "You were so happy back then, when you were still living at home." Haley glanced up, her eyes meeting mine across the room. She could read my face instantly. She saw the tension in my shoulders, the set of my jaw. She gave the faintest nod, stood up, and took a breath. "Mom." "Dad," she said, her voice clear and calm but commanding. "I have something to tell you." The room went still. All eyes turned to her. "We're having a baby," she said, smiling. "Julian and we're expecting. I'm 3 months pregnant." Silence followed. Diane looked stunned, and for a split second so did Gerald. But Diane snapped out of it first. She let out a gasp and rushed to her daughter, tears welling up in her eyes as she wrapped Haley in a trembling hug. "Oh, honey," she whispered. "A baby? Our baby." Gerald took a beat longer. He stepped forward cautiously, eyes flicking between Haley and me, clearly trying to process this new reality. "Congratulations," he said at last, the words stiff but sincere enough. "Thank you," I replied quietly, then leaned closer so only he could hear. "But let me make one thing crystal clear. This child will never be a pawn in your games. Never. I promise you that." Gerald didn't speak. His face hardened just slightly, but then he gave a slow, singular nod. He heard me. He understood. Later that night, as we drove home, Haley reached across the console and laced her fingers with mine. Her hand was warm and she squeezed gently. "They'll never really change, will they?" she asked softly, not with bitterness, just quiet realism. "No," I said honestly, "but they'll have to accept that we have." 3 weeks passed in relative calm. Then, out of the blue, a certified letter arrived at our door. It was from Gerald's attorney. Inside was a set of official documents, a deed to the house we'd been renting, now transferred into our names. Our house. Along with it, legal paperwork for a trust fund set up in our unborn child's name. There was no handwritten note, no apology, no hidden strings or conditional terms. Just the clean, final transfer of assets. Legally binding, irreversible. It wasn't an admission of guilt. Gerald wasn't built for apologies. But it was something. An acknowledgement. Maybe the only kind he knew how to give. A quiet way of saying, "You've won. I respect that." And in the summer, our daughter was born. We named her Eliza after my grandmother. Strong, kind, unshakable. The day we brought her into the world, Diane and Gerald came to the hospital with gifts in hand and surprisingly soft expressions. They didn't overstay. They cooed over the baby, took a few photos, and left with well wishes, no speeches, no suggestions, no thinly veiled judgments about how we should be raising her. In the months that followed, our relationship with them found a rhythm, a delicate, careful normal. Not warm, but civil. They never truly apologized for the past. I stopped expecting them to, but they also stopped trying to rewrite our lives or poke holes in my career. They'd finally realized something powerful. Control was no longer theirs to wield. One evening, I was in my studio, sifting through raw photos from a new shoot. The warm light of sunset poured in through the window. That's when Haley walked in, holding Eliza in her arms, her smile soft and tired in the best kind of way. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my work as I sat at my desk. I glanced at the screen and saw it was Haley calling. I picked up quickly, curious about what was on her mind. "My mother called," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of resolve. "She wants us to come for Christmas." I looked up from my computer, raising an eyebrow. "What do you think?" She hesitated for a moment before responding. "I think we should go. But with conditions," she added, the words deliberate. "We stay at a hotel, not their house. We leave when we want to leave, and there's no uninvited time with Eliza." I nodded, appreciating her boundaries. "Sounds reasonable." She sat down beside me, bouncing Eliza gently in her arms. As the baby cooed softly, Haley looked down at our daughter, her smile tender. "You know," she began thoughtfully, "I used to think that success meant making my parents happy, getting their approval, meeting their expectations, but now—" She paused, looking down at Eliza again before meeting my eyes. "Now I know success is about making choices I can be proud of. It's about standing by the people I love." I could see the peace in her eyes, the quiet strength that came from knowing she had built a life based on her own values and not someone else's. 2 weeks before Christmas, a large envelope arrived at our door, postmarked from Gerald's law firm. Inside was a glossy brochure showcasing his company's annual report, with my photographs spread across the pages. Landscapes, portraits, architectural shots. The kind of work I had done on my own terms, without his influence, without his control. There was a short note attached, written in his neat, formal handwriting. Hired the best photographer I know. Thought you'd want a copy. I didn't call him to thank him, and neither did he expect that. It wasn't about gratitude. It was about something else. Something unspoken. Maybe respect. Maybe the acknowledgement that I had found success on my own terms, outside of the world he tried to control. And more importantly, it was a quiet recognition of the new boundaries between us, the new understanding of our relationship. Acknowledging those boundaries that I knew was the first step to something resembling peace. That spring, I opened my own photography gallery in downtown Nashville. The grand opening was everything I had hoped for, a celebration of my work, my journey, and the new chapter I had created. Haley stood beside me, Eliza on her hip, glowing with pride as friends and clients filled the space. The walls were lined with images I had captured over the years, all of them reflecting my personal vision of the world, my art, untethered and unfiltered. Gerald and Diane came too, of course, as they always did when there was a significant moment in their children's lives. They didn't stay long, but they came. Diane held Eliza briefly, under Haley's watchful eye. Gerald shook my hand, nodded at the photographs with genuine approval, and then left, without offering any advice on how I should run my business, without trying to rewrite the story of my success. As we locked up that night, Haley turned to me with a question. Do you think they have changed? I thought about it for a long moment, weighing the truth in my heart. No, I said finally, but they've accepted that they can't change us. And sometimes that's enough. Later that night, as we sat on the porch of our new home, watching the stars appear over the mountains, I felt a quiet sense of contentment settle over me. Eliza was asleep in her crib upstairs, her soft breaths filling the stillness of the house. The air was crisp, the world outside peaceful and calm. As we sat there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, something inside me clicked, a realization I hadn't fully articulated before. I hadn't won by playing Gerald and Diane's game. I had won by refusing to play it at all. I had stood my ground, protected what mattered most, and built a life that was mine, all on my own terms. Not through manipulation, not through schemes or concessions, but through honesty, integrity, and quiet persistence. In the end, that was the most satisfying revenge of all. Living well on my own terms, surrounded by the family I loved, healthy, happy, and free. And in that peace, I knew we had finally won. Not just against Gerald and Diane, but against everything they had tried to impose on us. We had built something real, something they couldn't take away,